In a quiet suburban neighborhood, where picket fences line the streets and perfectly manicured lawns stretch as far as the eye can see, lived a young boy named Jack. At 12 years old, Jack was like many boys his age, curious, kind-hearted, and full of energy, but little did he know that a simple act of kindness would soon turn his world upside down and challenge everything he thought he knew about the world around him. Before we dive into Jack's story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this heartwarming tale, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Jack's world was small but comfortable. He lived with his parents, Susan and David, in a cozy two-story house with a big backyard where he loved to play. Every morning, Jack would wake up to the smell of his mom's pancakes and the sound of his dad's voice as he read the morning paper. It was a routine that made Jack feel safe and secure. But beneath the surface of this picture-perfect family, there were subtle undercurrents that shaped Jack's view of the world. His parents, though loving and well-intentioned, had instilled in him a cautious approach to life, especially when it came to interacting with strangers. "Remember, Jack," his mother would often say, "not everyone out there has good intentions. It's best to keep to yourself and avoid those who seem different." These words, repeated over the years, had taken root in Jack's young mind. He found himself eyeing unfamiliar faces with a mix of curiosity and apprehension, always wondering if they might be the dangerous people his parents had warned him about. Despite these cautionary tales, Jack had a heart of gold. He was the kind of boy who would help a classmate pick up dropped books or share his lunch with a friend who had forgotten theirs. This innate kindness often conflicted with the wary attitude he had been taught, creating a constant tug-of-war in his heart. What Jack didn't realize was that this internal conflict was about to come to a head in a way that would change his life forever. If only he had known what was coming, perhaps he would have looked at the world a little differently that fateful morning as he set off for school. The day started like any other. Jack woke up, got dressed, and headed downstairs for breakfast. His mom, Susan, was bustling around the kitchen, packing his lunch, while his dad, David, sat at the table, absorbed in his newspaper. "Jack, honey," Susan called out as she zipped up his lunchbooks, "I've packed you an extra sandwich today. I thought you might be hungry after your soccer practice." Jack grinned, always appreciative of his mom's thoughtfulness. "Thanks, Mom," he said, giving her a quick hug before grabbing his backpack. As he headed out the door, his father's voice stopped him. "Jack, remember what we talked about. Stay alert on your way home from school. There have been some unsavory characters hanging around lately." Jack nodded solemnly, the weight of his father's words settling on his young shoulders. "I will, Dad. Don't worry." Little did Jack know that this extra sandwich and his father's warning would play a pivotal role in the events that were about to unfold. The school day passed in a blur of lessons, laughter with friends, and the anticipation of the weekend ahead. As the final bell rang, Jack shouldered his backpack and set off on his usual route home. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk as he walked, his mind already on the video games he planned to play that evening. But as he rounded the corner near the convenience store just a few blocks from his house, something caught his eye. There, huddled against the brick wall of the building, was a man Jack had never seen before. The man's clothes were tattered and dirty, his hair unkempt, and his dark skin weathered by what looked like years of hardship. Jack felt a flutter of unease in his stomach as he remembered his father's words from that morning. Was this one of the unsavory characters he had been warned about? Every instinct told him to hurry past, to keep his eyes down and pretend he hadn't seen the man. But something made Jack pause. Maybe it was the way the man's shoulders slumped in defeat, or the quiet dignity in his tired eyes. Whatever it was, Jack found himself unable to simply walk by. As he stood there, conflicted, the man looked up, his gaze meeting Jack's. In that moment, Jack saw beyond the dirt and the ragged clothes. He saw a person, someone who looked hungry, tired, and in need of kindness. Without fully realizing what he was doing, Jack reached into his backpack and pulled out the extra sandwich his mother had packed. His heart pounding, he took a tentative step towards the man. "Excuse me, sir," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Would you like this sandwich? I have an extra one." The man's eyes widened in surprise, then softened with gratitude. "That's mighty kind of you, young man," he said, his voice rough but gentle. "I would appreciate that very much." As Jack handed over the sandwich, their fingers brushed for a moment. The man's hand was calloused and rough, telling a story of hard work and harder times. "Thank you," the man said simply, a tired but warm smile spreading across his face. Jack nodded, a mix of emotions swirling inside him. He felt proud of his act of kindness, but also a nagging worry about what his parents would say if they knew. As he turned to continue his walk home, he couldn't help but glance back at the man, who was now carefully unwrapping the sandwich as if it were a precious gift. What happened next would shock everyone, but in that moment, Jack had no idea of the chain of events he had set in motion with this simple act of compassion. As Jack walked away, his mind raced with conflicting thoughts. He felt good about helping someone in need, but he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he had done something his parents wouldn't approve of. The man's grateful smile kept flashing in his mind, contrasting sharply with the warnings he had heard all his life. By the time Jack reached his house, he had almost convinced himself to keep the encounter a secret. After all, nothing bad had happened, and it was just a sandwich. But as he opened the front door, he was greeted by his mother's worried face. "Jack, where have you been? We were starting to get worried," Susan exclaimed, pulling him into a tight hug. Jack felt a pang of guilt. Had he really taken that long? "I'm sorry, Mum. I walked home a little slowly today." Susan studied his face, sensing there was more to the story. "Is everything all right, sweetie? Did something happen at school?" For a moment, Jack considered telling her about the man and the sandwich, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he shook his head and forced a smile. "No, everything's fine. I'm just tired from soccer practice." As Jack headed upstairs to his room, he had no idea that his small act of kindness was about to turn his world upside down. If only he had known what was coming, perhaps he would have chosen differently in that moment. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a perfect Saturday. Jack was looking forward to a day of cartoons and maybe some time at the park with his friends. But as he sat at the kitchen table, munching on his cereal, a sharp knock at the door shattered the peaceful morning atmosphere. Jack watched as his father went to answer the door, curiosity piqued by the serious expressions on the faces of the two police officers standing on their porch. His mother joined them, her brow furrowed with concern. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," one of the officers asked, "we need to speak with you and your son about an incident that occurred yesterday afternoon." Jack's heart began to race. Could they possibly know about the sandwich, but how and why would the police care about something like that? As his parents ushered the officers into the living room, Jack felt a cold knot of fear forming in his stomach. This was it. He was in trouble, and he didn't even understand why. "Jack," his father called, his voice tight with tension. "Can you come in here, please?" With trembling legs, Jack made his way to the living room. The officer's eyes locked onto him as soon as he entered, and he felt as if he were under a microscope. "Jack," the female officer said, her voice gentle but firm, "we need to ask you about a man you may have seen yesterday, a homeless man near the convenience store on Maple Street." Jack's eyes widened. How did they know? He glanced at his parents, who were watching him with a mixture of confusion and growing alarm. I gave him a sandwich," Jack admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "He looked hungry, and I had an extra one. Did I do something wrong?" The officers exchanged glances before the male officer spoke. "No, son, you didn't do anything wrong, but the man you helped is wanted for robbing a gas station last week. We've been looking for him, and we saw your interaction on the security cameras." The room fell silent as the weight of this information sank in. Jack felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. The kind-looking man he had helped was a criminal. It didn't seem possible. His father's voice, tight with anger and fear, broke the silence. "Jack, what were you thinking? We've told you time and time again not to talk to strangers, especially someone like that." "I'm sorry," Jack whispered, tears welling up in his eyes. He just looked so hungry. As the officers continued to question Jack about his interaction with the man, now identified as Elijah Johnson, the atmosphere in the room grew increasingly tense. Susan and David exchanged worried glances, their faces a mix of fear, disappointment, and confusion. "Can you tell us exactly what happened, Jack?" the female officer asked gently. Jack took a deep breath, trying to steady his voice. "I was walking home from school and I saw him sitting there. He looked really tired and sad. I had an extra sandwich, so I offered it to him. That's all." "Did he say anything to you? Did he try to touch you or ask you to go anywhere with him?" the male officer pressed. Jack shook his head vigorously. "No, sir. He just said thank you and smiled. He was really polite." The officers nodded, jotting down notes. "You did a kind thing, Jack," the female officer said. "But next time it's better to tell an adult if you see someone who needs help, okay?" Jack nodded, feeling a confusing mix of emotions. He was relieved that he wasn't in trouble with the police, but the disappointment radiating from his parents was almost unbearable. As the officers prepared to leave, they turned to Susan and David. "We may need Jack to provide a statement in court. We'll be in touch about that. In the meantime, if you see Mr. Johnson again, please contact us immediately. Do not approach him." The gravity of the situation hit Jack like a ton of bricks. Court. He might have to go to court because he gave someone a sandwich. The world suddenly felt much more complicated and scary than it had just yesterday. After the police left, an uncomfortable silence fell over the Thompson household. Jack sat on the couch, his eyes fixed on the floor, unable to meet his parents' gaze. Susan and David stood nearby, their faces etched with worry and disappointment. "Jack," David finally said, his voice stern, "we need to talk about what happened." Jack looked up, tears threatening to spill from his eyes. "I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't mean to cause trouble. He just looked so hungry." David sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "Son, I know you meant well, but this is exactly why we've always told you to be careful around strangers. That man could have hurt you." "But he didn't," Jack protested. "He was nice. He just said thank you." Susan sat down next to Jack, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Honey, we know you have a kind heart, but not everyone in this world has good intentions. That man robbed a gas station. He's dangerous." Jack felt a flicker of doubt. The man he met didn't seem dangerous at all. He seemed sad and grateful. Could someone like that really be a criminal? "From now on," David said firmly, "I want you to come straight home from school. No stopping, no talking to anyone you don't know. Do you understand?" Jack nodded glumly, feeling as if his world had suddenly become much smaller and scarier. "Yes, Dad." As Jack trudged up to his room, his mind was a whirlwind of confusion and doubt. He couldn't reconcile the kind, grateful man he had met with the dangerous criminal his parents and the police described. Little did he know this internal conflict was just the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the world and the people in it. The days that followed were tense in the Thompson household. Jack felt as if he were walking on eggshells, acutely aware of his parents' watchful eyes. His afternoon walks home from school, once a time of relaxation and daydreaming, now felt like a supervised march. His father had even started picking him up some days, citing safety concerns. At school, Jack found it hard to concentrate. His mind kept drifting back to the encounter with Elijah Johnson. He couldn't shake the image of the man's grateful smile, so at odds with the picture of a dangerous criminal. During lunch, he overheard some classmates gossiping about the homeless robber who had been lurking near the convenience store. Jack wanted to speak up, to tell them about the kind, tired man he had met, but fear and confusion kept him silent. One afternoon, about a week after the incident, Jack came home to find his parents in serious conversation with a man in a suit. As he entered, the adults fell silent, exchanging meaningful glances. "Jack," his mother said, her voice unnaturally cheerful. "This is Mr. Lawson. He's a lawyer, and he needs to talk to us about what happened last week." Mr. Lawson turned to Jack with a practiced smile. "Hello, Jack. I'm here to help prepare you for the court appearance. You're going to be a very important witness in Mr. Johnson's trial." Jack's stomach dropped. He had almost managed to convince himself that the whole incident was over, that life would go back to normal. But now, faced with the reality of a court appearance, the gravity of the situation hit him anew. As Mr. Lawson explained the court process, using words like testimony and cross-examination, Jack felt increasingly overwhelmed. He was just a kid who had given someone a sandwich. How had it turned into something so big and scary? "Remember, Jack," Mr. Lawson said, his voice serious, "it's very important that you tell the truth about everything you saw and did that day. Mr. Johnson's future depends on it." The weight of this responsibility settled on Jack's young shoulders like a heavy blanket. He nodded solemnly, suddenly feeling much older than his 12 years. That night, as Jack lay in bed unable to sleep, he couldn't help but wonder about Elijah Johnson. Where was he now? Was he scared? Did he regret taking Jack's sandwich, knowing it had led to his capture? As these thoughts swirled in his mind, Jack realized that this experience was forcing him to confront complex issues he had never considered before. Issues of justice, compassion, and the gray areas that exist between right and wrong. Little did Jack know, the court appearance would be just the beginning of a journey that would challenge not only his own beliefs, but those of his entire family and community. As he finally drifted off to sleep, he had no idea that the most shocking revelations were yet to come. The day of the court appearance arrived with a sense of foreboding. Jack stood in front of his bedroom mirror, fumbling with the tie his father had insisted he wear. His reflection stared back at him, a young boy trying to look grown up but with eyes wide with apprehension. "Jack, honey, are you ready?" His mother's voice called from downstairs, a hint of tension evident even in those few words. "Coming, Mum," Jack replied, taking a deep breath to steady his nerves. The drive to the courthouse was silent, the air in the car thick with unspoken worries. Jack's parents exchanged concerned glances, while Jack stared out the window, watching familiar streets roll by. Everything looked the same, and yet nothing felt normal anymore. As they approached the imposing courthouse building, Jack felt his heart rate quicken. The stone steps leading up to the entrance seemed to stretch endlessly before him. Each step felt heavier than the last as they made their way inside. The interior of the courthouse was a maze of long hallways and intimidating wooden doors. Jack stuck close to his parents, feeling small and out of place amidst the bustle of lawyers, clerks, and stern-faced adults. They were directed to a waiting area outside the courtroom, where Mr. Lawson greeted them with a reassuring smile. "Remember what we practiced, Jack," Mr. Lawson said quietly. "Just tell the truth about what you saw and did. That's all anyone expects from you." Jack nodded, his mouth too dry to speak. As they waited, he couldn't help but scan the faces around him, wondering if he might catch a glimpse of Elijah Johnson. Part of him was scared to see the man again, but another part desperately wanted to confirm that the kind, tired eyes he remembered hadn't been a figment of his imagination. Suddenly a hush fell over the waiting area. Jack looked up to see a group of people entering, flanked by police officers, and there in the middle of the group was Elijah Johnson. Jack's breath caught in his throat. Elijah looked different now. He was clean-shaven, his hair neatly trimmed, and he wore a suit that seemed a size too big for his thin frame. But his eyes, those were the same eyes Jack remembered, filled with a quiet dignity despite the circumstances. What happened next shocked everyone in the room. As Elijah was led past them, his eyes met Jack's. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, to Jack's amazement, Elijah's face broke into a warm smile. He nodded slightly at Jack, a gesture of recognition, and was that gratitude? Jack felt his parents stiffen beside him, their hands gripping his shoulders protectively. But Jack couldn't look away. In that brief moment of connection, all his doubts and fears crystallized into a single powerful realization. Regardless of what Elijah might have done, he was a person, a human being capable of kindness and appreciation. Before Jack could process this revelation, they were being ushered into the courtroom. The proceedings began, a whirlwind of legal jargon and formalities that made Jack's head spin. He sat with his parents in the gallery, watching as lawyers presented their cases and witnesses took the stand. Finally, Jack heard his name called. On shaky legs, he made his way to the witness stand. As he was sworn in, he caught sight of Elijah sitting at the defendant's table. The man gave him a small, encouraging nod, which somehow helped calm Jack's nerves. The questioning began, and Jack found himself recounting the events of that fateful day. He described seeing Elijah outside the convenience store, the decision to offer his sandwich, and the brief interaction they had shared. As he spoke, Jack realized that his voice had grown stronger, more confident. He wasn't just reciting practiced answers. He was telling his truth. "And did Mr. Johnson say or do anything to frighten you?" the prosecutor asked. Jack shook his head emphatically. "No, ma'am, he was very polite. He just said thank you and smiled at me." "Did he ask you for the sandwich?" "No, I offered it to him. He looked hungry and I had an extra one." Jack could feel his parents' eyes on him as he spoke, but he kept his gaze focused on the lawyer questioning him. He was determined to tell the whole truth, just as Mr. Lawson had advised. As the questioning continued, Jack noticed something strange happening in the courtroom. The atmosphere seemed to shift. People who had been looking at Elijah with suspicion and fear now glanced at him with curiosity, and perhaps a hint of sympathy. Jack's simple account of their interaction had humanized Elijah in a way that no legal argument could. When Jack was finally allowed to step down from the witness stand, he felt drained but oddly satisfied. He had done what was asked of him. He had told the truth. As he made his way back to his seat, he couldn't help but glance at Elijah once more. The man's eyes were glistening with unshed tears, and he mouthed a silent "thank you" to Jack. This moment didn't go unnoticed. Jack's mother, Susan, who had been watching the proceedings with growing unease, saw the exchange. For the first time since this ordeal began, she found herself wondering if there was more to Elijah's story than they had assumed. As they left the courthouse that day, Jack felt as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. But little did he know this was just the beginning of a journey that would challenge his family's perceptions and beliefs in ways they never could have imagined. The drive home from the courthouse was quiet, each member of the Thompson family lost in their own thoughts. Jack stared out the window, replaying the events of the day in his mind. His father, David, gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw clenched in silent worry. But it was Susan who broke the silence, her voice soft but determined. "I think we need to talk about what happened today," she said, turning in her seat to look at Jack. "How are you feeling, honey?" Jack considered the question for a moment. "I'm okay, I guess. It was scary at first, but I'm glad I got to tell the truth about Mr. Johnson." David's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "Jack, I know you think you were helping, but that man is dangerous. He committed a crime." "But Dad," Jack protested, finding a courage he didn't know he had. "He didn't seem dangerous. He was just sad and hungry." Susan exchanged a glance with her husband. "David, maybe we should consider that there might be more to this story than we initially thought." David's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Susan, you can't be serious. The man robbed a gas station." I know," Susan said, holding up a hand to calm her husband. "But did you see the way he looked at Jack in the courtroom? That wasn't the look of a hardened criminal." As his parents continued to discuss the day's events, Jack felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they were starting to see Elijah the way he did, as a person who had made a mistake, but who was still deserving of kindness and understanding. This conversation would mark the beginning of a shift in the Thompson family dynamic. What happened next would challenge their preconceptions and force them to confront their own biases in ways they never expected. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions and debates in the Thompson household. Jack found himself in the middle of discussions he never thought he'd be having with his parents. They talked about homelessness, about the justice system, and about the grey areas that exist between right and wrong. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Susan made an announcement that stunned both Jack and David. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice steady but her hands fidgeting with her napkin. "I want to visit Mr. Johnson in jail." David's fork clattered onto his plate. "You want to what?" I can't shake the feeling that there's more to his story," Susan explained, "and after seeing how he interacted with Jack at the courthouse, I feel like we owe it to ourselves, and to him, to at least hear him out." Jack's heart raced with excitement. "Can I come too, Mum?" Susan hesitated, looking to David for support. To everyone's surprise, David let out a long sigh and nodded. "I don't like it, but I trust your judgment, Susan. And maybe it will give us some closure on this whole situation. This decision would change everything for the Thompson family. If only they had known what was coming, perhaps they would have approached that jail visit with even more open minds and hearts." The day of the visit arrived, and Jack found himself walking through the imposing doors of the county jail, flanked by his parents. The stark institutional environment was a far cry from the warm, comfortable world he was used to. The clanging of metal doors and the echoing footsteps of guards made him acutely aware of the gravity of their situation. As they were led to the visitation area, Jack's mind raced with questions. What would Elijah be like in this environment? Would he be angry? Scared? The Elijah he had met on the street and glimpsed in the courtroom seemed so at odds with this cold, forbidding place. Finally, they were seated at a small table, and Elijah was brought in. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he saw the man who had been occupying his thoughts for weeks. Elijah looked tired, the orange jumpsuit hanging loosely on his frame, but his eyes lit up with recognition when he saw Jack and his family. "Thank you for coming," Elijah said softly, his voice rough with emotion. I didn't expect anyone to visit me here." Susan leaned forward, her initial apprehension melting away in the face of Elijah's obvious gratitude. "Mr. Johnson, we felt like we needed to hear your side of the story, if you're willing to share it with us." Elijah nodded, taking a deep breath before he began to speak. What he shared over the next hour would shake the Thompson family to their core. Elijah told them about his life before, how he had been a respected teacher, with a loving wife and a comfortable home. He spoke of the tragic car accident that had taken his wife's life, leaving him alone and grief-stricken. The pain of loss had led him down a dark path of alcohol abuse, which in turn led to the loss of his job and eventually his home. "I never thought I'd end up on the streets," Elijah said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But once you're there, it's so hard to find your way back." As Elijah continued his story, Jack watched his parents' faces. He saw the shock, the sadness, and most importantly, the growing understanding in their eyes. This man, whom they had dismissed as a dangerous criminal, was revealing himself to be a person who had suffered immense loss and had made a desperate choice in a moment of hopelessness. "The day I met Jack," Elijah said, turning to look at the boy with a small smile, "was the first time in months that someone had looked at me like I was human. That sandwich, it wasn't just food, it was hope." Jack felt tears welling up in his eyes, and he noticed his mother discreetly wiping away her own. Even his father, who had been skeptical about this visit, was listening intently, his brow furrowed in concentration. As Elijah finished his story, a heavy silence fell over the room. The Thompsons found themselves grappling with a new reality, one where the lines between right and wrong, good and bad, were far blurrier than they had ever imagined. Susan was the first to speak. "Mr. Johnson, Elijah," she said, her voice filled with empathy. "Thank you for sharing your story with us. I can't imagine how difficult this has been for you." David, who had been quiet throughout most of the visit, finally spoke up. "I have to admit, I came here today with a lot of preconceived notions, but hearing your story, it's made me realize how quick we can be to judge without knowing the full picture." Elijah nodded gratefully, his eyes glistening. "I made a terrible mistake," he said. "I know that, and I'm prepared to face the consequences. But having you here, listening to me, it means more than you can know." As the visit came to an end and the Thompsons prepared to leave, Jack felt a surge of emotion. Without thinking, he stepped forward and gave Elijah a quick hug. "I'm glad I gave you that sandwich," he said quietly. Elijah, surprised by the gesture, patted Jack's back gently. "So am I, young man. So am I." As they left the jail that day, the Thompson family knew that nothing would ever be the same. They had entered those doors seeing Elijah Johnson as a criminal, a threat to their community. They left seeing him as a human being, flawed, struggling, but deserving of compassion and a second chance. What happened next would not only change their lives, but would ripple out to affect their entire community in ways they never could have predicted. The simple act of listening, of seeking to understand rather than judge, had set in motion a chain of events that would challenge and ultimately transform their understanding of justice, compassion, and the power of second chances. In the days following their visit to the jail, the Thompson family found themselves in a state of emotional turmoil. Their conversation with Elijah had forced them to confront their own biases and preconceptions, leaving them grappling with difficult questions about justice, compassion, and social responsibility. Susan, in particular, couldn't shake the image of Elijah, once a respected teacher, now confined to a jail cell. She spent hours researching the challenges faced by people re-entering society after incarceration, and the more she learned, the more determined she became to help. One evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, Susan broached the subject that had been weighing on her mind. "I think we should help Elijah," she said, her voice firm despite the nervousness she felt. David looked up from his plate, his expression a mix of surprise and concern. "Help him? Susan, I know his story was moving, but he still committed a crime. What exactly are you suggesting?" Jack watched the exchange with wide eyes, his fork forgotten in his hand. He had been hoping his parents would want to help Elijah, but he hadn't dared to bring it up himself. Susan took a deep breath before continuing. "I've been doing some research. There are programs that help people like Elijah get back on their feet after they're released. Job training, housing assistance, counseling. I think we could make a difference in his life." David ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Jack recognized as a sign of his father's internal struggle. "It's a big risk, Susan. What will the neighbors think? And are we even qualified to help someone in his situation?" "Maybe we're not," Susan admitted, "but we can learn. And as for the neighbors, well, maybe it's time we all learn to look beyond our assumptions and try to make a real difference in our community." Jack, unable to contain himself any longer, chimed in. "I want to help too. Mr. Johnson made a mistake, but he's not a bad person. He just needs a chance." David looked from his wife to his son, seeing the determination in their eyes. He realized that this moment was about more than just Elijah Johnson. It was about what kind of people they wanted to be, what kind of example they wanted to set. Finally, David nodded slowly. "Okay," he said, "okay, let's do it. But we need to be smart about this. We'll need to talk to Mr. Lawson, see what's legally possible, and we'll need to prepare ourselves for the challenges ahead." This decision would change everything, not just for Elijah, but for the entire Thompson family and eventually for their community. Little did they know, their choice to extend a helping hand would set off a chain reaction of compassion and understanding that would ripple out far beyond their small suburban neighborhood. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity for the Thompsons. Susan threw herself into researching rehabilitation programs and support services for former inmates. David, despite his initial reservations, used his connections in the local business community to explore job opportunities for Elijah. And Jack, eager to contribute, came up with the idea of starting a clothing drive at his school for people re-entering the workforce after incarceration. Their efforts didn't go unnoticed. As word spread about what the Thompsons were doing, reactions in the community were mixed. Some neighbors applauded their compassion, while others viewed their actions with suspicion and disapproval. One Saturday morning, as David was mowing the lawn, his next-door neighbor, Mr. Peterson, approached the fence that separated their properties. "Hey, Dave," he called out, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Heard you folks are getting involved with that homeless fellow who was arrested. You sure that's wise?" David turned off the mower, wiping sweat from his brow as he considered his response. A few weeks ago, he might have agreed with Mr. Peterson's implied criticism, but now he found himself standing tall, a sense of purpose filling his chest. "You know, Bill," he said, "I used to think the same way, but we've learned a lot about Mr. Johnson's situation, and we believe he deserves a second chance. We're just trying to do what we think is right." Mr. Peterson shook his head, clearly unconvinced. "Well, I hope you know what you're doing. Just be careful, all right?" As David watched his neighbor walk away, he realized that this was just the beginning. Their decision to help Elijah would require them to stand firm in the face of skepticism and criticism, but somehow, that only strengthened his resolve. Inside the house, Susan was on the phone with Mr. Lawson, discussing the legal aspects of their plan to help Elijah. The conversation was complex, filled with terms like parole conditions and rehabilitation programs, but Susan listened intently, jotting down notes. "Yes, I understand," she said, her voice determined. "We'll need to be careful not to overstep any legal boundaries, but there's still so much we can do to help." As she hung up the phone, Jack appeared in the doorway, his eyes bright with excitement. "Mom, guess what? My teacher said we can use the school gym for the clothing drive. We're going to call it Threads of Hope. Isn't that cool?" Susan smiled, feeling a surge of pride in her son's enthusiasm. "That's wonderful, Jack. You're really making a difference." What happened next would test the Thompson family's commitment in ways they never expected. As they continued their efforts to help Elijah, they found themselves facing challenges from all sides: skeptical neighbors, concerned school administrators, and even their own doubts and fears. One evening, as the family sat around the dinner table discussing their progress, the doorbell rang. David went to answer it, returning moments later with a grim expression on his face. "It's Officer Martinez," he said quietly. "She wants to talk to us about Elijah." The family exchanged worried glances as Officer Martinez entered the room. Her face was serious as she addressed them. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, Jack," she began, "I understand you've been in contact with Elijah Johnson and are planning to assist him upon his release." Susan nodded, her chin lifted defiantly. "That's right. We believe he deserves a second chance." Officer Martinez sighed. "I respect what you're trying to do, but I need to warn you. Mr. Johnson has a history that goes beyond the gas station robbery. There are risks involved in associating with him." The room fell silent as the implications of her words sank in. Jack looked from his parents to Officer Martinez, confusion and fear battling in his young mind. Was Elijah not the person they thought he was? David was the first to speak. "Thank you for the warning, officer. We appreciate your concern, but may I ask, has Mr. Johnson been violent in the past?" Officer Martinez shook her head. "No, his offenses have been non-violent, mostly petty theft and drug possession, but I still think you should exercise caution." As Officer Martinez left, the Thompson family found themselves at a crossroads. This new information challenged their perceptions once again. They had believed in Elijah's story of a good man brought low by tragedy. Now they had to reconcile that with a history of repeated offenses. "What do we do now?" Jack asked, his voice small. Susan and David exchanged a long look, years of shared understanding passing between them. Finally, Susan spoke. "We keep going," she said firmly. "We knew this wouldn't be easy. Elijah's past is complicated, but that doesn't change the fact that he needs help to turn his life around." David nodded slowly. "You're right, but we need to be smart about this. We'll talk to Mr. Lawson again, see what additional precautions we should take." This decision would change everything. In choosing to continue supporting Elijah, despite the risks and complications, the Thompsons were embarking on a journey that would not only transform Elijah's life, but their own as well. As the day of Elijah's release approached, the Thompsons found themselves caught in a whirlwind of preparation. Susan had secured a small apartment for Elijah through a local housing assistance program. David had reached out to his contacts and arranged for a job interview at a local warehouse. And Jack, with the help of his school, had collected boxes upon boxes of professional clothing for Elijah and others in similar situations. The morning of Elijah's release dawned bright and clear. The Thompsons waited outside the county jail, a mix of excitement and nervousness coursing through them. As the doors opened and Elijah stepped out, blinking in the sunlight, Jack couldn't help but rush forward. "Mr. Johnson," he called out, waving enthusiastically. Elijah's face broke into a wide smile as he saw the family. "Jack, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't believe you're here." Susan stepped forward, extending a warm hand. "Welcome back, Elijah. We're here to help you get started on your new life." As they drove Elijah to his new apartment, the conversation flowed easily. Elijah expressed his gratitude repeatedly, his eyes wide with disbelief at the second chance he was being given. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you for this kindness," he said softly, as they pulled up to the apartment building. David turned in his seat to face Elijah. "You can repay us by making the most of this opportunity. We believe in you, Elijah." The next few weeks were a period of adjustment for everyone. Elijah threw himself into his new job, determined to prove himself worthy of the trust placed in him. The Thompsons checked in regularly, offering support and encouragement. But the path was not without its challenges. One evening, Elijah called the Thompsons in a panic. I saw some of my old friends from the street," he admitted, his voice shaking. "They wanted me to come hang out with them. I said no, but it was hard." Susan listened patiently, offering words of encouragement. "You did the right thing, Elijah. Recovery is a process, and you're doing great." As the weeks turned into months, Elijah's progress became evident. He was excelling at his job, had started attending support group meetings, and was even considering taking some community college classes. The Thompsons watched with pride as the man they had once feared transformed into a valued member of their community. But not everyone was as supportive. The Thompsons still faced skepticism and criticism from some neighbors and community members. Whispers followed them at school events and local gatherings. One day, Jack came home from school with tears in his eyes. "Some kids were saying mean things about us," he sniffled. "They said we were stupid for helping a criminal." Susan pulled Jack into a hug, her heart aching for her son. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry you had to hear that. But you know what? Sometimes doing the right thing isn't easy or popular. We're helping Mr. Johnson because it's the right thing to do, not because it's easy." David, who had been listening from the doorway, joined them. "Your mum's right, Jack, and you know what? I'm proud of us. We're making a real difference in someone's life." This moment marked a turning point for the Thompson family. They realized that their decision to help Elijah hadn't just changed his life, it had changed them too. They had become stronger, more compassionate, and more united in their commitment to making a positive difference in the world. As the months passed, Elijah's transformation became increasingly apparent. He had not only maintained his job, but had been promoted to a supervisory position. His apartment, once sparse and utilitarian, now felt like a real home. Photos adorned the walls, many of them featuring the Thompsons at various outings and celebrations. One sunny Saturday, almost a year after Elijah's release, the Thompsons invited him over for a barbecue in their backyard. As Jack helped his father at the grill, he couldn't help but marvel at how natural it felt to have Elijah there, laughing and chatting with his mother as they set the table. "Dad," Jack said quietly, "do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't given Mr. Johnson that sandwich that day?" David paused, considering the question. "You know, son, I think about that a lot. That one small act of kindness set off a chain of events that none of us could have predicted. It just goes to show that even the smallest gesture can make a big difference." As they sat down to eat, Susan raised her glass in a toast. "To second chances," she said, smiling at Elijah, "and to the power of compassion." Elijah's eyes glistened with unshed tears as he raised his own glass. To the Thompsons, he added, his voice thick with emotion, who saw a person, not a criminal, and gave me a chance when no one else would. The meal was filled with laughter and conversation, the warmth of friendship and family palpable in the air. As the evening wound down, Elijah helped clean up, insisting it was the least he could do. "You know," he said as he and Susan washed dishes side by side, "I've been thinking about how I can give back. There are so many others out there who need the kind of help you gave me." Susan's eyes lit up. "That's wonderful, Elijah. What did you have in mind?" "Well," Elijah said, a hint of excitement in his voice, "I was thinking about starting a support group for people transitioning out of incarceration, maybe even a mentorship program. I want to do for others what you did for me." This decision would change everything once again. Elijah's desire to pay it forward would not only continue his own journey of redemption, but would also create a ripple effect of positive change throughout the community. In the weeks that followed, Elijah threw himself into planning his support group. The Thompsons offered their full support, with David helping to secure a meeting space at the local community center and Susan assisting with outreach efforts. Word of Elijah's initiative spread quickly, and soon other community members began to take notice. Some were skeptical at first, but as they saw the positive impact Elijah was having, attitudes began to shift. One evening, as Elijah was leaving his first support group meeting, he was approached by none other than Mr. Peterson, the Thompsons' once skeptical neighbor. "Mr. Johnson," Mr. Peterson said, extending his hand, I want to apologize. I was quick to judge you and the Thompsons for helping you, but seeing the change in you and the good you're doing now, well, it's opened my eyes." Elijah shook Mr. Peterson's hand, a warm smile on his face. "Thank you, sir. That means a lot to me. We all make mistakes, but it's how we learn and grow from them that matters." As Elijah's program grew and flourished, the Thompsons watched with pride as their community began to transform. The once skeptical neighbors now spoke of second chances and redemption. Jack's Threads of Hope clothing drive became an annual event, growing larger each year. Susan started volunteering at a local women's shelter, while David used his business connections to create job opportunities for people trying to rebuild their lives. Their efforts inspired others in the community to get involved, creating a ripple effect of positive change. What had once been a neighborhood defined by caution and suspicion was transforming into a place of compassion and second chances. And it all started with a boy, a sandwich, and a willingness to see the humanity in others. As our story comes to a close, we're reminded that even the smallest acts of kindness can have far-reaching consequences. Jack's decision to offer a sandwich to a hungry stranger set off a chain of events that transformed not only Elijah's life, but an entire community. We've seen how compassion can overcome fear, how understanding can replace judgment, and how second chances can lead to remarkable transformations. The Thompson family's journey teaches us that when we open our hearts and minds, we have the power to create positive change in the world around us. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you liked this story as much as we did, I handpicked this next one that will warm your heart. Please don't miss it. Click here to watch it.